scientific meltdown that some of the naysayers promise will come if we show any kind of critical thinking about the discussion of the theory of evolution. Polling data in 2005 showed that nearly 2/3 of U.S. adults believe humans were created by God. This number has remained high over several decades of polling. Harris Interactive, it's a polling firm, a very respected polling firm. They often report the findings to a national audience on these science-related matters. Shows in their findings that 54% of Americans believe that humans did not evolve from an earlier species. A minority agree with the idea that the fossil discoveries and science in general proved Darwin's theory of evolution. It's a very small number. An appeal to popular sentiment, especially from a group of people who work outside of science, doesn't prove that science in the U.S. isn't on the decline. It could be. But we can assume from the Nobel Prize results, as well as the large list of PhDs on the Descent from Darwin list, that scientific knowledge is where it should be. It's on the increase. It isn't going down the drain, and we're not doomed as a nation. Continued spending on research will likely play the biggest role in whether or not the U.S. continues to dominate in science in these various fields. It looks as if an adherence to the idea of creationism isn't what will put us behind the rest of the world. It might be spending in science from a federal or organizational level, but that's okay. If that particular issue was such a strong indicator of scientific knowledge, other nations that deny creationism in large measure should show an increase over the U.S. in these various scientific fields, but they don't. According to polling done by the magazine Science, in a list of 34 nations, the United States leads only Turkey in its disbelief in the theory of evolution. Iceland, the nation in which its citizens are most apt to accept the theory of evolution in a Darwinian sense. However, Iceland isn't particularly known for its scientific dominance or anything to do with science, really. The argument of research funding could easily be used, but if acceptance of evolution is such a vital factor in determining scientific literacy, wouldn't such a disparity between the U.S. and Iceland on this scale make up for the disparity in funding? I can't imagine that national sentiment would cause such damage in the sciences. A report by the Council of Europe states, quote, "The intelligent design movement would seem to be anti-science for several reasons. Firstly, the nature of science is distorted. Secondly, the objectives of science are distorted. The writings of the leaders of this movement show that their motivations and objectives are not scientific, rather religious." Could this possibly be true? Could all the scientists who adhere to this philosophy be cranks whose intent is to promote religion over science and actually to distort science? I can't imagine that thousands of scientists could pull off such a ploy together without being easily recognized as frauds by people everywhere. The polling data would suggest that most Americans not only identify, but they also agree with the creationist and the intelligent design movements. The core arguments within these two fields are also beliefs that Americans adhere to. The creationist beliefs, actually, the fact that they lead to scientific ignorance, as the Times would conclude, or there's a particular branch of science that doesn't make sense, it just doesn't match up with the evidence. To suggest that evolution is vital to scientific knowledge, is it true? Do we need to believe in a Darwinian evolution for science in general? Dr. Jerry Bergman, who holds a PhD, thinks not. In an article he wrote for True Origin, a creationist website, he questions the famous statement by biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky that, quote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Surely he was talking about Darwinian evolution, we can argue. Bergman decided to check the biology textbooks at the college where he teaches to evaluate this claim. According to his own research, Darwinism was rarely mentioned at all. Professor Emeritus Dr. Philip Skell, who is a member of the renowned National Academy of Sciences, concludes that the same thing as Bergman did. He asked the question, quote, "Would you have done the scientific work any differently if you believed Darwin's theory was wrong?" His answer was a resounding no. For most of his colleagues whom he asked, quote, In my work, it would have made no difference. That's what most of them said. So I think we can conclude that if a scientist were to not accept the narrow range of Darwinian evolutionary theories and the basic confines within that, those proposed by Charles Darwin himself and those after, there is little real-world use to the theory to begin with in most sciences. And so any argument that a denial of the theory would lead to a bad science falls completely flat. So, Americans believe that evolution doesn't fully explain the history of life on Earth. Many thousands of scientists agree. Surely more scientists embrace the theory of evolution in the Darwinian sense than those who don't. That's fine. But science itself was never a popularity contest, and popularity certainly doesn't make a theory true or false, either way. If scientists who have just as much expertise as their colleagues can buy into theories that most scientists find unpopular, can't American students discuss these issues as well? Will discussing creationism in our classrooms, even if it's a science classroom, lead to the death of science? No evidence exists to suggest that's the case. In fact, it's obvious that many well-respected scientists are doing very important work every day in their fields of science, and many of them are tossing the theory of evolution aside completely, without any obvious harm to their research, their funding, or their work in general. We can assume that their scientific knowledge isn't suddenly worthless because they deny what some claim are the central tenets of life on Earth as we know it, in a Darwinian sense. The nation will survive. A little critical thinking and refusing to allow a discussion on these issues does a disservice to scientists and students alike. Denying that critical thinking and the ability to discuss these issues, it hurts us all, I would argue. I think that it should be allowed in the classrooms, even the science classroom. There's no evidence to suggest that it hurts science on any level. In fact, this is the descent, Billy, if you can get this. This is all I need to point to. This is the descent of Darwin list. Here you see on these boards, on this board, paper, page after page after page. It includes 665 scientists who are PhDs that have signed the descent from Darwin list, where they say they do not, the narrow Darwinian evolution ideas do not fully explain all of what we know in biology in the world. 660 names. Can they all be wrong? Can't we argue that maybe they're right and maybe students in the country have the right to the critical thought process on this argument? I would argue that this is not going to ruin science. It's not going to ruin the country. Let the states decide. Let the teachers decide. Let the schools decide. If one school decides they don't want to pursue it at all, that's fine. If another school decides they do want to pursue it, that's also fine. It's not going to ruin the world.